Hello. Welcome to the Nerdy Folks Podcast, a conversation about the nerdy things we love and the things that matter most. My name is Matthew Seifel Anderson. I'm the host of the show and chaplain to the nerd community. Today I'm talking about Time Bandits, the new Apple TV show and the classic 80s movie. The Apple TV show was a show I wanted to love but just couldn't quite love. I quite enjoyed it for what it was, like I always do, but the original has a very special place in my heart, and I think there are some very specific reasons why it's a much better artistic creation. But before I get into my opinions on Time Bandits and begin to wax eloquent about that amazing movie, I want to go to an interview that I did at Minnesota Youth Convention. I have to say thank you to everyone who stopped at the booth and said hi. It was an absolute blast hanging out there, seeing students, and seeing friends of mine from my youth pastor days. Minnesota Youth Convention, if you don't know, is a big convention for my denomination for students. A huge number of students all converge on Rochester, Minnesota once a year. And this year, instead of bringing a group of kids, I was there with the podcast interviewing people. So here we go.
So I once had this world where I built a Minecraft Lego set in Minecraft. There was lava in the set and wood, though, so it ended up burning down. Nice. The set also ended up getting destroyed when I dropped it down the stairs. Stairs are dangerous.
Yeah, and that right there is why I enjoy hanging out with and working with students. They say the most random things. They're super fun to talk to, and it was awesome hearing about that kid's Minecraft world that he accidentally burned down. And speaking of kids, one of the biggest things about Time Bandits that really adds to its charm is the fact that it has a kid in one of the lead roles. Here's a little bit from Wikipedia about the original film. The film tells the story of a young boy taken on an adventure through time with a band of thieves who plunder treasure from various points in history. And that really only tells a small bit of the story. A fuller synopsis would go something like this, and this is just me shooting from the hip. A group of dwarves who work for the Supreme Being in the shrubbery department steal a map of the universe that allows them to jump around to different points in history, and they decide to become the Time Bandits, and a young kid from England gets swept up into their adventure. Now, you might think that seems a little sacrilegious or even blasphemous, but 80s Time Bandits really makes some very deep and theological points through its filmmaking and its storytelling, and I'll get into that a little later, but I had a few people come up to my booth at Minnesota Youth Convention, and I'm trying to fish for what people are into and ask them questions about, hey, what do you nerd out about? What are you into? Let's talk about some of this stuff. And I had a few people tell me that they were theology nerds. So let's go to one of those. Hey, we're at MYC, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what you love to nerd out on.
Hello, my name is Jor-El. I'm a theology nerd. I hope you guys have a great morning, afternoon, evening, and night, and study up on theology. You'll find wondrous things there.
Yeah, Jor-El was fun to talk to. He had a lot to say, and I just took a little sliver of what he said to use on the show today, but thanks so much, Jor-El, for stopping by. Now, I mentioned that Time Bandits from the 80s had a deep theological point. And it's not a point that's made in a subtle way. It's right out there. The main character, Kevin, he's the kid. He asks the Supreme Being why evil is allowed to exist. And that is a question that so many people have asked themselves. And that's a question that has really decided if people are going to remain in faith or if they're going to leave faith or how they view God. I mean, it's a very central question to our existence, right? What is the meaning of evil and good? And is there good and evil? So he asks the Supreme Being, why is evil allowed to exist? And the Supreme Being just says, I think it has something to do with free will. And then Kevin is brought back out of his magical adventure back to the real world. And his house is on fire, and at the end of the movie, it turns out that his parents die. It has a super dark ending that kind of catches you off guard because the whole movie is so funny and so crazy and lighthearted. But when you consider the movie in its entirety, that question is really at the heart of the whole film. Why would the Supreme Being allow a group of misfit dwarves to steal a map to the universe that would allow them to become the Time Bandits? Because a universe without free will is not a universe worth having. Free will is what makes relationships and love and true existence possible. And that's really the point of the whole movie. Why does evil exist? Because God wants free will to exist. Why can the Time Bandits exist? Because God wants free will to exist. And why can truly tragic things happen? Because God wants free will to exist. The subject of free will is a whole huge topic within philosophy and theology, and a lot of ink has been spilt on that topic, and so I'm not going to share my opinions or really go on a deep dive into that today. But what I do want to say is that I really appreciate Time Bandits as a work of art because it tackles such a deep issue and in a really profound way. I do find it strange that there are a lot of people who don't actually believe in free will. There are theological reasons for not believing in free will if you come from certain traditions, and people in the philosophical world often don't believe in free will. So it's kind of interesting. I personally do believe in free will to a point. I talked to a second guy at Minnesota Youth Convention who was also into theology quite a bit. We didn't talk about free will, but he did have some interesting ideas on the topic of heresy and the importance of having sound theology. And he actually used a horror movie as an analogy, and it was pretty interesting. John has got some really interesting, deep thoughts about an old school horror movie, The Thing.
John Carpenter's 1982, the film The Thing. If you've never heard of it, maybe never seen it, it kind of goes on this principle. The general rule of thumb that is followed is that there's always safety in numbers, and The Thing does a really good job of actually removing that thought because you actually have no idea who's infected by this creature. The idea is that if a single cell of this thing gets on you, whether it be through blood, saliva, any means of matter, it can actually slowly begin to take over you. And oftentimes you would never even know it before you become a monster yourself. And what's really interesting about this film, while I do not believe it was the author's original intention, I think that there's actually a significant purpose that can be attributed to Christianity in the terms of looking at this movie and saying that this is actually a really good illustration for how we see heresy happen in the church. I think that oftentimes we assume that heretics in history have just randomly appeared out of nowhere with these thoughts and these ideas as if they weren't brewing for a time, as if there wasn't a time period where it started as just a thought, as just a seed, and then over time it bloomed into something and it became a monster.
Hey, John, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and your passion for theology. I love Jesus' admonition to love the Lord our God with all of our mind. Now, I do want to talk some about the Apple TV version of Time Bandits. I really, really enjoyed the cast. I thought the acting was great. I thought the Kevin character was super awesome. I loved how they expanded the story and used more of his family. And it was just a lot of fun to be had in those episodes. And I am a little bummed that they're not going to do a season 2. It's been canceled. However, I think the Apple TV version of Time Bandits is telling a story that comes from a very different foundation, like a foundation of belief and a foundation of worldview. And I think this is best illustrated by the finale. So, spoiler alert. In the finale, the good characters have all ended up in the realm of pure evil because they're trying to save Kevin's parents. And then, lo and behold, the Supreme Being shows up in a very funny sequence. He's shooting lightning. It's actually Titi Watika. I don't think that's how you say his name, but the director who directed and wrote the last couple Thor movies. Anyway, he shows up. He's shooting lightning out of his fingers. He's prancing around. It's pretty funny. And the Supreme Being and Pure Evil, a.k.a. the Devil, both try to convince Kevin to give them the map. For some reason, neither one of them can reach out and just take it. They have to convince him. It would seem the obvious choice would be to give the map back to the Supreme Being. However, he has learned throughout the course of the show that the Supreme Being has a plan to wipe out mankind and wipe out life on the earth and just start over because he feels he made a bunch of mistakes in his first go-around as creator. Of course, Pure Evil wants the map so he can make life miserable, but he promises that he'll leave life as it is, except for the fact that he'll make it miserable. So what does Kevin do? He deliberates, he stalls, and in the end, he gives the map to Pure Evil. And they run away, and then it's discovered that they've actually fooled the Supreme Being and Pure Evil, and they've given the map to neither one of them. Actually, it ends on a cliffhanger because a third party has taken the map, but I won't go into all that. That was supposed to be saved for season 2, which apparently we're never going to get. Here's the thing about the worldview of this movie. It's essentially giving us a nihilistic worldview. It's essentially saying all higher powers are impotent. You have to become your own higher power and grab life by the horns and just make your own decisions. And I found it interesting that the Supreme Being's plan, which really revealed that he was a villain in this series, is satirizing the idea that God would make mankind and then judge mankind as evil. I think asking that question is legitimate. That is a legitimate theological question. Why does God do that? For me, a big part of the answer is that God wanted to make a world that was real, but to do that, he had to allow free will to exist. And that was the original point made by the 1980s Time Bandits that I find so deeply meaningful. And on top of that, the movie is hilarious and definitely worth your time if you haven't checked it out. Well, hey, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm going to leave you with one more interview I did from Minnesota Youth Convention, and then we'll sign off. So, Caleb, what's your favorite, fandom? What are you into?
Oh, Star Wars.
Okay.
Star Wars, and maybe Lord of the Rings, too. I love all that.
I think Star Wars has some really amazing faith tie-ins,
yeah.
Light side, dark side. Mm-hmm. Do you see...
Is episode 6, when they're, Luke does not give up on seeing the good in his father, and that's kind of I feel like we can do the same thing. Like we, as Christians, going out into the world, we can see all the bad things around us, but we can also see there's still good in people. We can still call Christ up out of people. That's one thing I think of.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thanks so much for hanging out. I really, really appreciate all of you. You all matter to God deeply. Hope you know that. And until next time, connect with us through nerdyfolks.com. Find us on social. And love ya. God bless. Take care. Bye-bye.